Imagine a room in southern Italy around 530 BCE, where a group of grown men sits in absolute silence while staring at a heavy curtain. A voice speaks from behind the fabric to explain how the universe works. Yet none of these men have spoken a word in years, and not a single person in the room has ever seen the speaker's face. You definitely know his name because you probably memorized his theorem in middle school, and then forgot it a few years later. The math was never the most interesting part of his life, so we have to ask who Pythagoras actually was and why his followers swore their most sacred oaths on a triangle. Long before he became the guy from your geometry textbook, he was something much stranger. By the time Pythagoras reached the city of Croton, around 530 BCE, he had already lived 40 years, which is a detail that really matters. He didn't just show up as some kid with a new theory, but instead arrived carrying the weight of decades of intense initiation. He spent years with Egyptian priests who forced him to prove his worth before sharing their secrets, studied with scholars in Babylon, and lived in a cave on the island of Samos before any of that even happened. That cave on Mount Kirkus wasn't just a place to hide from the world, and local legends say he chose it specifically because it offered no light, no noise, and no distractions. He spent his time there practicing a specific kind of discipline by stripping away every sensation until he could hear something quieter underneath. This experience became the literal foundation for the school he eventually built in Croton. And you simply can't understand his teachings without understanding that cave first. When he finally started taking on students, the very first thing he demanded was the exact same thing the darkness had required of him. He didn't ask for silence for a week or a month, but instead forced his followers to stay quiet for 5 full years. These new students were called the acousmatikoi, which translates to the listeners, and they were strictly forbidden from speaking whenever he was nearby. They sat in that room and listened, without the right to ask questions or argue, and they couldn't even look at him because he stayed hidden behind a curtain. Modern historians still go back and forth on how literally we should take these stories, but the split between the different types of students is well documented. The listeners made up the outer ring of the school, while those who survived the years of silence and proved they could receive information without reacting were promoted to the inner circle. These advanced students were called the mathematikoi, and only then did the curtain finally come down. That curtain wasn't just for theatrical effect, because it functioned as a psychological filter for everyone in the room. Pythagoras believed that most people are incapable of truly hearing what is said to them because they are too busy rehearsing their own response in their heads. The silence wasn't meant to be a punishment or a random rule, but was actually the entire architecture of his teaching method, where you had to train the ear before you could ever trust the mind. The cave on Samos and the curtain in Croton were really just the same discipline applied in 2 different ways. In both situations, the goal was to stop making noise long enough to notice the reality that was already there. But what he found underneath that noise is where things get truly strange. Here is what he discovered once he looked past the noise. At some point in his travels, though the exact date is still a matter of debate, Pythagoras began experimenting with a single string stretched over a wooden box. This instrument was called a monochord, and it worked quite simply because when you pluck the string, it produces a specific note. If you press a bridge down at the exact halfway point and pluck it again, the note that comes back is the same one, but an octave higher. The ratio between those 2 lengths is exactly 2 to 1, which is clean and simple, and you can find the musical fifth at a ratio of 3 to 2, or a fourth at 4 to 3. Every single interval that sounds harmonious to your ear maps perfectly onto a ratio built from the first 4 whole numbers. That discovery is interesting on its own, but the leap Pythagoras made from that point is what really changed the world. He realized that if musical harmony runs on mathematical ratios, and those ratios are a feature of how sound behaves rather than a human invention, then math is more than just a tool. It is the world itself. The structure underneath everything you see is not made of water or fire or atoms, but is instead made of numbers. If that rule applies to a vibrating string, he figured it should apply to a planet as well. The planets move through the sky in predictable patterns that can be described as ratios, and he argued that these movements produce a hum so vast and constant that humans have lost the ability to notice it. It is the same way you stop hearing the buzz of your own refrigerator after the first day, because your brain just tunes it out. He called this the music of the spheres, and according to the writer Porphyry, Pythagoras claimed he could actually hear it because his own constitution was tuned to perceive what everyone else ignored. His followers believed him, and while that might sound like they were just being gullible, it was actually the logical endpoint of what the monochord had already proven. If a string produces harmony through a ratio, and the entire cosmos moves through those same ratios, then the cosmos must produce harmony. The conclusion was not some mystical guess, because it followed directly from the physical evidence he found. The only mystical part was the claim that he was the only one who could hear the song. This is where the Tetractys comes into the picture. This symbol consists of 10 points arranged in a triangle, with 4 rows starting with 1 point on top and ending with 4 on the bottom. And when you add 1, 2, 3, and 4, you get 10. Each row represented a different layer of reality. The single point at the top stood for pure divine unity, which was the source of everything before division, while the second row represented the first split into duality and dimension. The third row stood for harmony and the mediation between opposites, and the bottom row of 4 points represented the physical world of earth, air, fire, and water. The whole triangle served as a map from the divine down to the material, and it was held together by the same ratios that governed the monochord. The sacred oath that the Pythagoreans swore was not taken on Zeus or Apollo, but was instead taken on this specific symbol. To them, it was not just a diagram on a wall, because it represented the actual geometry of existence. By swearing on the Tetractys, they were swearing on the very structure of everything. The music of the spheres described how the universe was built, but what Pythagoras taught next was about the nature of the people moving through it. He taught that your soul does not die when your body gives out, but instead shifts into another body, whether that is a human or an animal, or whatever the next life requires. This process repeats across many lifetimes until the soul has finally worked through whatever it needs to learn. This was a genuinely unusual claim in 6th century Greece, where most people assumed the dead went to a gray and formless underworld to stay there forever. Pythagoras said that was wrong and insisted people came back, and he claimed to know this because he remembered doing it himself. He claimed to have specific memories of past lives. He said he had once been Euphorbus, who was a Trojan war soldier mentioned in the Iliad, and he could even cite the verses to prove it. Porphyry records that he demonstrated this memory to his associates using what he described as irrefutable arguments. Whether you find that convincing depends on your own beliefs, but the point is that he was not speaking in metaphors. He meant this as a factual account of his own personal history. The famous story about the dog makes this idea very concrete. He once stopped a man from beating a dog, But he did not do it out of a general concern for animals. He did it because he claimed to recognize the soul of a dead friend in the dog's cries. He heard a human voice in the yelping and stepped in to stop the pain. Again, this was not a poetic way of speaking, but a literal recognition of a person across species. This belief is the real reason beans were banned in his community. Ancient accounts offer several explanations, like the idea that beans resemble the gates of Hades, or that their pulp smells like blood in the sun. But the core logic was that beans were thought to carry the souls of the dead. Eating a bean was not just a dietary choice for a Pythagorean, but was a moral act because you might be consuming a person. Their daily practices followed this same logic. If the soul is moving through lifetimes and gathering the consequences of its choices, then every single day is a serious transaction. Before going to sleep, they would ask 3 questions. Where did I go wrong? What did I do? And what did I leave undone? This was not journaling or therapy, but was instead a form of soul accounting. In the morning, they would rise before the sun to walk alone and plan the day with deliberate intention. The body is not just a body, but is an instrument the soul is currently playing, and an instrument that is out of tune cannot play in harmony with the rest of the world. What is easy to miss when you look at these ideas separately is that they are actually one single system. The silence of their lifestyle trains the ability to perceive, and the math reveals exactly what is there to be perceived. The soul is the thing doing the perceiving across one lifetime and then the next. Pythagoras was not teaching 3 different subjects, but was instead teaching one single truth from 3 different angles. And those angles only make sense when you see how they fit together. Pythagoras never actually wrote anything down, so every idea we have about him filtered through his students and then through Plato before reaching the rest of Western philosophy. This means the man who basically started the whole chain of modern thought never put a single word on paper himself. Even the famous theorem that carries his name was likely figured out in Babylon long before he was born. But the things he actually came up with were much stranger and harder to put on a test. After spending 40 years in total silence and study, he finally started teaching a philosophy that wasn't really about triangles at all. The real question driving his life was whether the universe makes a sound, and he spent his final years trying to figure out if humans could ever learn to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this.